Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on a Friday evening to celebrate the International Day for Biological Diversity, which fell on the 22nd of May 2024. It falls on the 22nd of May every year. And this year, we decided to commemorate this day, this very important day, today. Now, the Institute of Environmental Professionals is an institute that fosters environmental conservation and also networking amongst individuals that work in this field. We have a diverse group of members in this organization: architects, engineers, lawyers, scientists. So all of them come together to work on environmental conservation issues, so very important to our country. And amongst those, I think biological diversity is one of the most paramount important elements that we have that needs to be conserved and managed. So therefore, I think it's really important that we celebrate this day and also raise awareness amongst the global community on this International Day for Biological Diversity. Now, the Institute itself would like to remind all our chartered environmental professionals who are registered here today that participating in workshops and webinars and of this nature allows you to collect CPD points. So it is very important that you join and take part and also be an active member of the Institute. So we warmly welcome all our chartered environmental professionals as well as all other members and members of the general public who have also registered here and are part of this evening's session. Now, today, this year, the International Day, every year it has a theme. And this year, the theme of the evening is Be Part of the Plan. Now, the plan in question is the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Plan, which actually came into being in December 2022, when the world came together and agreed on this global plan to transform our relationship with nature. So now in Sri Lanka too, we have traditionally had a National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, which the country has been, putting out and monitoring its progress. So it's not only the state sector, but the NGO sector, the private sector, they all come together in working towards this plan. So there is a concerted effort, and I think you will hear from our keynote speaker the importance of biodiversity in our country and how we should conserve it. Now, today we have a very distinguished professional to speak to you, and I will leave it to our moderator to introduce him. Our moderator this evening is Mr. Rishan Sampath. Rishan is a good friend of the Institute, as well as the organization that I represent, Biodiversity Sri Lanka, which the Dilma Conservation helped to, initiate. And it's an honor to invite Rishan, who has a lot of private sector experience. He has, before he joined Dilma Conservation, as the head of conservation, as well as the head of sustainability of the Dilma Ceylon Tea Company, which is a premier corporate entity that works on biodiversity. It's a luminary that really shows and paves the way to other corporates also on how sustainability should be taken and how biodiversity should be looked at. So it is a great pleasure for me to invite Rishan to moderate this session on behalf of the Institute so that we have a very productive evening. So whilst warmly welcoming all of you to this evening's session, I would like to hand over to Rishan. So it's over to you, Rishan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yasaratna, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our special webinar in celebration of Environmental Biodiversity Day 2024. So as Ms. Yasaratna mentioned that this year, the Biodiversity Day theme was be part of the plan. So in another term, this is a call to action for all stakeholders to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity, and also to support the implementation of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This global framework is also known as the Biodiversity Plan, and it provides opportunities for cooperations and partnerships among different sectors. So everyone has a role to play here. Because of that, we all are a part of this particular plan. So today we can discuss how Sri Lanka can contribute to post-2020 targets. IEPSL organized this webinar in collaboration with the Dilma Conservation. Thank you, IEPSL, for inviting us to be a part of this webinar. Dilma Conservation is a dedicated arm under Dilma Silonti PLC, who committed for environmental conservation. From 2007 onward, Dilma Conservation is running a lot of biodiversity conservation projects along with climate change research and environmental awareness campaigns. Dilma Conservation is also working towards promoting sustainable use of environmental, especially in partnership with other organizations like IEPSA. So I think without wasting your time, let's move on to the webinar. I invite you all to actively participate this webinar. You also can post your questions through the chat box. So at the end of the session, I can ask them from our speaker. So today we are pleasure to have Senior Professor Devaka Veerakon with us. In the biodiversity circles, Professor Devaka Veerakon doesn't really need an introduction, but just for formalities, Professor Devaka currently holds the post of Senior Professor at University of Colombo and Head of the Department of Zoology and Environmental Science. He also served as the technical advisor on fauna for the Red Listing Program for Sri Lanka from 1996. He also a technical advisor to the Ministry of Environment on conservation of threatened species. Professor Veerakon has also served as a consultant on biodiversity to IUCN Asian Region Office, IUCN Sri Lanka, and Biodiversity Sri Lanka. He is also a member of the Asian Elephant Specialist Group. So, Professor Devaka, over to you.
Thank you, Rishan. Permit me to share my screen for a moment here. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. So basically, as Shirani pointed out in the opening remarks, we are here to commemorate the International Biological Diversity Day. And this year, the main theme is be a part of the plan. And that plan basically refers to the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, or what is referred to as Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which has 4 major goals and 23 targets that the world is trying to achieve within the next 6 or 7 years as the initial phase, and the second phase will extend up to 2050. So basically, this is the objective, or these are the goals of the 2020 Biodiversity Framework. Currently, we are living in a world where the biodiversity is declining rapidly. It is considered as one of the 3 major crises this world is facing today. So the aim of these targets is to reverse this by 2030 to bring it to a 0 level, and by 2050 to go for a full recovery. So this is a fairly serious undertaking given our past record. This will require a great deal of work, and basically if we continue in our current trajectory, this is the way we are going to be heading in the future. But if we try to actively do conservation, we might be able to bring it back to somewhere here. But if you want to really push it back to zero and maybe become net positive, we need to do more. Mostly, we have to be thinking about how we can make our production sustainable and also how we can control our consumption. Because at the moment, one of the fundamental issues that is facing our planet is the human population is undergoing rapid increase. We are sort of at 7.2 billion at the moment, and soon we will be reaching 9 billion. So our population is rising, and at the same time, our consumption rates are also increasing. So we have a dual issue that we have to deal with. The regulation of population control has multiple socio-political uh, issues, but the consumption is something that we can work on, because at the moment, human being, which is just one species out of estimated 13 million species, is using nearly 40% of the resources of our planet to support our way of life. So we are practically eating through the food chain, and we are creating such a huge imbalance, which is what is posing the triple planetary crisis, the climate change crisis, the biodiversity loss, and also the land degradation issue. So over the past few decades, a lot of work has been done, but we are still seeing that we have to go a long way. So this is how the 2020 biodiversity, global biodiversity framework has come into action, trying to reverse back the current trend that we see on the planet. So basically, like I said, in order for us to reverse it back, this is what is required. Conservation alone will not help us to bring back the biodiversity. Conservation will help us to reduce the current trajectory to somewhat, but we need other things like climate change action, reducing other drivers that are affecting biodiversity, sustainable production, and reduce consumption. So you can see when you look at this list, this is or reversing the current trend will require a Herculean effort on our part. And that is why I think it's important when we commemorate this days like this for us to take stock, look at where we are, and try to understand what our role is in this and what can we do to be part of this global effort to reverse the biodiversity loss and the other subsequent changes that are associated with it. But when we look at the 2020, post-2020 global biodiversity targets, what we also have to understand is before this came into being, we had another set of targets, which were referred to as IG targets, which comprised of 20 targets, which we were trying to achieve during the period 2011 to 2020. So the target that was set to achieving these 20 IG targets was 2020. And so the post-2020 global biodiversity framework comes in the aftermath of IG targets to show that this is what we are trying to achieve after what we have tried to do with IG targets. So now that the period of implementation for IG targets have come to an end, the the Secretariat of CBD has carried out an exercise to see where do we stand with respect to these targets. So target setting is something that we all do. We set targets for our own life, for our institution, for countries, for the whole world. So with respect to a target, when you evaluate where you are, there can be number of potential outcomes. So let's say this is the baseline, and this is the target we set. So I've taken a simple example. The current forest cover is 28. So if our target is to increase this to 30% in the next 10 years, that is the target we are going to chase. So at the end of the implementation period, what we have to do is turn around and ask, where do we stand with respect to what we have set out to do? So, like I said, we can have 6 different outcomes when we do such an analysis. One is we may exceed the target. Although we were planning to do 30, maybe we have reached 31%, which is the best scenario we can think of. But the second outcome could be we have simply managed to achieve the target, which is good enough because that's what we have set up to do. The third outcome could be that we are progressing towards the target, but we have not reached there, although we were planning to reach 30% in 10 years. We haven't got there, but we are sort of en route to achieving that, maybe in a few more years into the future. The fourth thing that can happen is no change. Even though we have set ourselves a target, we haven't done much, therefore we are still at the baseline. The worst case scenario we can think of is that if you move away from the target, that you are trying to achieve 30%, but you end up with less than 28% in 10 years' time. That would be the worst case scenario we can think of. The sixth outcome could be we really don't know where we stand at this particular time with respect to this. So these are the, if you set yourself a certain set of targets, and if you give yourself a certain time frame to achieve it, at the end of that, it's important for us to look back and see where do we stand with respect to what we plan to do. So CBD or CBD Secretariat, the Secretariat of Convention of Biological Diversity, carried out this exercise and they put out a report. And this is what that report says. So basically, if you look at this, I've given you a key here to understand what these colors are. So basically, the blue color means we have exceeded the target. Uh, Green means we have achieved it. 3 is we are on our way to achieving it. 4 is no change. 5 is we are moving away, purple, and gray means we don't know. But when you look at this picture, uh, ideally, we would expect, so under each target, we had several sub-targets. So under target 1, we had 2 sub-targets. Under target 2, we had 4 sub-targets, and so on. So when you look at this picture, if we were successful, we want this picture to have more of blues. But you would see that we have only been able to exceed just one target out of one sub-target out of the 20 sub-targets we have set out. We have only been able to achieve only about, you can see this target, this out of the 20 targets, 5 targets we have achieved partially because we have achieved certain sub-targets. For others, we are sort of on our way, but we can also see that in some instances, there is no change. For most of the targets, you can see a lot of red, and you can also see purple. We are moving away from the target. So this is the backdrop within which we have to think what we have ahead of us. Because we have the last decade, we have set certain number of targets and sub-targets, and at the end of that period, when we look at what we have achieved, we can see that we have not been able to achieve many of the targets or sub-targets we have set for ourselves. So in Kunming, they have come together to discuss this and see what is going to happen after 2020, given this level of performance. And that discussions ended up in Montreal, and the Kunming Montreal Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework came into action. Now we have 23 targets. We were chasing 20 targets earlier. Now we have 23 targets we are trying to achieve within the next 6 or 7 years, because the time frame we have set up is 2030. We are already halfway through 2024, which leaves us about 6.5 years to achieve these targets, which are very, very ambitious. But it's important for us to set higher targets, because if you aim for the sky, if you aim for a star, you will at least reach the sky. So it is natural for us to set higher targets, and even if we don't achieve it fully, if we get close, that is some victory than not getting anywhere closer. But when we look at the the last 10 decade, the last decade and our performance, we see that we have a long way to go if we are to at least make some positive change on this planet. So basically, this is what this year's theme for the Biological Diversity Day: be a part of the plan. That is, the plan is this plan that they are referring to on a global scale. And it is a plan that cannot be achieved by governments or few agencies. It is a plan, if we are to achieve these targets, every citizen in this world will have to play a role. And that is why it's important for us to talk about it. That's why it's important for us to understand this. And therefore, we can see how we can position ourselves in order to change our way of life, even in a small way, or do more than what we can, more than that, to push towards these targets, because that is the only way we can achieve it. So basically, what I would like to do is take some of these targets and talk about it. Because of the limited time available, we will not be able to talk about all of these targets, but I have selected few targets which I think is important uh, for us to discuss, because if we can influence these, we can make a huge difference. uh, and some of the achieving some of these targets will help us to achieve other targets, because basically a lot of these targets have a lot of overlap with each other. When you achieve one, you not only achieve that target, you can sometimes achieve partially few other targets as well. So the first thing that we have to be thinking about is uh, better land use planning. This is one of the critical requirements for Sri Lanka, because we are a small island. We are the 25th largest island in the world, but we have a huge human population and a growing population. And because of this, if you look at how we are using our land, two-thirds of Sri Lanka's land extent is used by humans for agriculture or other human activities. So only about one-third of the land is available for rest of the species, which is the protected area network. But in the human use areas, I would come back later and show you that human use areas are not devoid of biodiversity. There is biodiversity in these areas, and there are things that we can do to improve this. So human use areas can be managed in such a way that they will support biodiversity and eventually will help us to achieve some of these targets. So uh, one of the biggest issues in Sri Lanka is because we are a small country and because we have such a large population, spatial planning is a very critical thing, because to use the limited land available in the most sustainable manner, we need to have very good spatial planning, which is what is uh, not happening to an optimum level in this country at the moment. We do have a national physical plan, but there are a number of issues with it. A lot of people do not agree with some of the things in it. So it needs to be improved and it needs to be mainstreamed. So even though the National Physical Plan has certain shortcomings, our duty should not be to criticize that, but to help them to build that plan better. And it is also important that as citizens, for us to influence the successive governments to follow this plan. Because a lot of times what happens is we have plans, but uh, when we try to do things on ground, a lot of people don't pay attention to these plans and do things uh, on their own. And the other issue we see is that uh, the successive governments have come up with their own plans. So every 5 years or so, we have a new vision statement or some new plan. But what we need for Sri Lanka is we need one common plan which will meet the requirements of the citizens of this country in a sustainable manner. And what we need our governments to do is to push that plan, implement that plan as well as possible. And we should measure governments by their ability to implement it. But this is not how things are done in Sri Lanka. So it's very important for us to have a plan as to how we are going to utilize the limited land and still achieve our development goals. And we should advocate successive governments to stick to this plan and try to make it a reality. So that is one thing that we have to do, which is a very challenging thing. But without that, it is not going to be possible for us to achieve these goals, because the current approach is to have haphazard development, which is not according to a plan, which doesn't provide the benefits of the investments we are making on development. Especially if you look at the investments we are making on irrigated agriculture, we see that uh, in most places where we have established large-scale irrigated agriculture, there is also human-wildlife conflict, which is an escalating problem in this country. And the human-wildlife conflict fails to prevents us from achieving the desired goals of those investments. So I think it's very important for us to understand that these investments, if they are to achieve the goals, must be done in a proper manner. And when it comes to biodiversity, the the central plan that the country should be using is what is called the NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan. And what you see here is the last NBSAP that had an operational period from 2016 to 2022. So now we are in 2024. So this NBSAP is already out of date, and we are in a process of trying to update it. So when while we are updating it, it's also important for us to take stock and see how much of what we have set out in this plan have been achieved and what has not been achieved, and why didn't we achieve those, and try to find solutions to that when we develop the next plan. So most likely we have to update this in this plan was developed in alignment with IG targets. Now we have a separate set of global targets, so we need to update the NBSAP in align with the post-2020 biodiversity targets, and that is one way for us to influence uh, or contribute to the 2020 post biodiversity targets by having a national plan and implementing it so that as a nation we will contribute to this plan. And there are so many countries who are parties to this plan. And if all of them do their part, at least we will end up in 2030 in a better position compared to where we were in 2020. So that is the whole idea, and that is why it's important for us to discuss this, understand this, and align with this. So the second one is or restoring at least 30% of the degraded land. Now, habitat degradation is the reverse of an ecological process which we refer to as primary succession. If you look at our planet, 500 million years ago, the land did not have any vegetation cover. The plants invaded the terrestrial habitat roughly about 500 million years ago, and the plants transformed the terrestrial habitat into a from a brown planet that existed before that was converted into a blue-green planet. So uh, this is this has happened through a process called primary succession. So you start off with bedrock, and slowly small plants will establish, which creates the environment for other plants to establish, and eventually it will grow into what is referred to as a climax vegetation that is possible on that land. So this is what is referred to as primary succession. So what various things, including people and various natural processes, can push this thing back, like a landslide or a forest fire, some natural process like that, or humans, when we do deforestation, logging, we can push this climax vegetation back in this direction. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes we push it all the way back here. Like if you take a practice like chain cultivation, where the farmer goes, burn the whole cut a part of a forest, burn it, and start growing a crop. So basically, you bring it from here to here, you grow a crop, and you let it go for a few years. So it will start again going through this succession, which is called a secondary succession. So basically, on our planet, these two processes are going back and forth like a seesaw. Uh, Primary succession has happened, then degradation happened, then secondary succession, which keeps going, pushing things back and forth. But restoration is an attempt to try and push ecosystems to the climax condition, because the climax condition, or the climax vegetation is a very complex vegetation which can support large number of different species, and that is why forests are very important, because compared to a similar sized area, a non-forested area, the forest can support large number of species because it has a complex structure, uh, which results due to this process called primary succession. So restoration is an attempt to push all the details. So if it is here, that is the climax, that is where we want it to be. If we are anywhere before that, we are in a state of degradation, but the level of degradation may vary from slightly degraded and back here heavily degraded lands. So the restoration, what we are trying to do is we are trying to push it back. And sometimes if it is slightly degraded, you don't have to do much. If you remove the stressors, the ecosystem will recover. If it has degraded halfway through, we will have to assist the process of this, speed it up by assisting the process. If it has come all the way down here, we may have to do some additional work before even we start uh, reforestation activity. So this is what restoration is. And there is an entire science behind it, which is called restoration ecology, which tells us how to plant, what to plant, where to plant, when to plant, and things like that. But this is the period 2020 to 2030 is declared by UN as the decade of restoration. And we have again a set of very ambitious targets to achieve by end of 2030. So this particular target is in alignment with that, where we are expected to restore at least 30% of our degraded habitats. So I am only showing you forest here. When we talk about degraded habitats, it's not just forests, grasslands, wetlands, coral reefs, offshore habitats like seagrass beds, all of these ecosystems can undergo same type of degradation due to variety of reasons. So restoration is a process where we are trying to restore many of these ecosystems back to its ideal condition. So when we talk about restoration, it's not just forests, it's about restoring uh, whole ecosystems to its ideal condition. So when you look at Sri Lanka, we can see the number of restoration projects that are going on. Some people have, some of these projects are done by the state, but the private sector has played a huge role here. Various agencies have taken restoration on their own, and institutes like Biodiversity Sri Lanka has managed to bring private sector partners together to invest on some critical pilot studies that are necessary for us to work out the science of restoration. So we see some very positive signs. But these are all small projects. These projects need to be mainstream because the level of restoration we need is many, many folds higher than what we are doing today. But what we are doing today gives us the lessons that we need to learn in order to how to do this. Where can we do it? How do we do it? Because restoration is not a simple thing. Uh, sometimes it takes years for us to understand what type of approaches we need to deal with a restoration project. But I think all these small pilot projects have given us the necessary knowledge for us to mainstream it. We are ready to go to the next phase of doing it in large scale. But this requires a national plan as to where do we restore and what habitats, what kind of restoration approaches are needed, and so on, because this requires a lot of investment as well. Because restoration work requires a fairly heavy investment. Now, a lot of times we think the money is not there, but the money is there. When you look at a lot of these development projects, most of them, the projects that results in loss of forests, when they, under their mitigation, they say we are going to restore so many hectares of forest and they put money aside for that process. But when we look at the performance of a lot of these projects, what we see is even though they have pledged to restore certain hectareage of forest and they have put aside money, actual restoration has not taken place because there aren't enough places for them to do it at the site of the where the project is taking place. So the model that we have followed thus far is pledging to do restoration, putting money aside, but then at the end of the day we come back and say we can't find enough uh, land for us to do the restoration. But what we really need to do is if we have a restoration plan and if we have a common account to which people can put money, which drives this restoration plan, what we have to tell these development projects, okay, you can, if you're going to destroy so much of forest due to this development project, you have to place this amount of money, which will drive the national restoration program. Because some large projects like Moragakanda project has pledged 1,000 million rupees for restoration. But very little of that has been used for actual restoration because in that in the region of development, we could find places where that kind of restoration can be carried out. So it is sort of useless if you're pledging money and if you're not doing it, then actually all what you end up is the destruction, but not the subsequent restoration work. So what we really need is a national restoration plan and a fund that will drive this and various there are various ways to raise funds to keep this thing going if we have such a project on the ground. So we have to advocate to bring such a national restoration uh, plan and get them to implement it. Organizations like Forest Department and Wildlife Department will have to take the lead role in it. And scientists who have been involved in a lot of these restoration projects can bring the technical know-how into this. So this can be done, but it has to be, some leadership has to be taken in order for this to happen. Then the next the objective is to set aside at least 30% of the land and sea area for conservation. Now, when we look at Sri Lanka, if you look at our land area, 30% of our land area has been set aside as protected areas. But we have an ocean around us, which is 8 times the size of the land area, and the protected areas in the marine sector are very, very low. So when we look at the 30, we have 30% uh, of our land protected, but when we look at our marine ecosystem, only a very small amount of the marine ecosystems are protected. You have the Bari, you have Adams Bridge here, you have Hikkaduwa and few other uh, marine national parks or sanctuaries, but the representation in the marine sector is very low. But when you look at also the protected area network on land, which is what you can see in this map, you can see that much of our protected areas are in the dry zone. When you look at the wet zone, only about 14% of the land area of the wet zone is under some kind of protection. But what you see in this map is the distribution of the endemic species in this country. And you can see nearly 80% of the endemic species are distributed in the wet zone and the montane zone. So we have a mismatch in our protected area network planning. Most of our critical biodiversity is here. Most of our protected areas are in the dry zone. That doesn't mean that the dry zone protected areas are not important, but what it means is our protected area system is not representative because it is not representing the critical biodiversity of Sri Lanka. So we have to see how we can change this scenario and provide protection to the wet zone. The other aspect that is lacking in our protected areas is many of them do not have a management plan. So when you set aside a protected area, you have to have a certain conservation objective and a set of prescriptions, management prescriptions that will help you to achieve achieve these objectives. But when we look at most of our protected areas, we find that they do not have a proper management plan. So if we want to improve this target, just setting aside 30% is not enough. We have to manage those lands and we have to also see how we can address the gaps. One gap is how do we address the issue in the wet zone. The other gap is how do we increase the protected area coverage in our marine system. Now, when you look at the wet zone, we also have another issue. Like if you look at the forest cover in the wet zone, you can see that these forests are heavily fragmented. Most of them exist as small forest patches, sometimes less than 200 hectares in size. But these forests are very important. We find that a lot of these small forest patches support critical species. I'll just share with you a few examples. Here is the haycock forest, which is a very small forest patch in the Hiniduma area, surrounded by tea estates, and this species is restricted to this forest. So it's an endemic species restricted to this forest patch. Here is another example, the Lul Kandura Forest Reserve, which is located right next to the Lul Kandura estate, the first estate that was established in Sri Lanka. Again, this species filed out as Dilma have been recorded from here. So most of its population is found in this small forest patch. This is another forest patch that is located in Bulat Singhal area in Kalutara district. It's a very small forest patch called Walawatta Waturan, and it's a unique forest type called the swamp forest. There are two species, Stemnoporus moonii, Ohoravel, and Misua stylosa or Suana. These two species are only found in this small forest belt. They are endemic to Sri Lanka, and this is the only known location where they are naturally found. So the point I'm trying to make is even the small forest patches in the wet zone are very, very important. So the challenge in front of us is how do we protect these small forest patches? And the second thing is how do we maintain their continuity? So here is a place where we have a strategic approach where when you look at the wet zone, you will find that tea and rubber plantations as well as coconut accounts for nearly 25% of the land use in the wet zone. What you see here in this map is the distribution of the tea and rubber estates in the wet zone. And within these lands, we find about 20%, roughly about 60,000 hectares, are existing in some form of natural habitats. sometimes natural forests, sometimes natural wetlands, etc. And some of these are fairly large, some are small, many are less than 200 hectares in size. But if we can effectively conserve this, because already this most of these natural habitats are protected by the estates themselves, because it is necessary for them to, as a part of their sustainability initiatives. So if we protect them, we can increase the protected area cover by 4% in the wet zone, which is a significant uh, 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 increase in the protected area coverage in the wet zone. And we have also found over the past decade or so from the studies we have done that these forest habitats support large number of critical species, threatened species, endemic species, and sometimes we have found that some of the species are found only within these forest patches inside the estate landscape. And last year, a project came supported by the Global Environmental Facility. The funding has been received to invest on these natural habitats within the estate landscape and ensure that they are properly conserved and managed, because they can contribute significantly for the national biodiversity conservation effort. And the fourth one is prevent the loss of species. Now, Sri Lanka is unique because we have very high level of endemicity. When you look at some of our taxa like freshwater crabs, 99% of the species we found are only found here. It's very high among land snails, amphibians is more than 80%. But on the other side, we see most of these endemic species are threatened with extinction. So for nearly 4 decades, we have been doing red listing in this country, identifying species at risk, but we haven't not done anything about it. It's like going to a doctor and getting diagnosed, but not receiving any medication. So once we do a red list, once we identify species at risk, the next stage should be we come up with recovery plan. So up until about 10 years ago, we have only been doing red listing without doing recovery action. But we see during the last decade, slowly, this uh, condition is changing. We have seen NGOs like Wildlife and Nature Protection Society has launched a program with support from HEMAS to try and recover as many species as possible, and they are providing the funds for people to develop recovery plans and implement it. This is a very interesting initiative, very important initiative, which is a much needed initiative, because only through these we can prevent or hold the loss of species. And another target we have is dealing with invasive species. At least manage 50% of the invasive species in uh, globally and nationally. Now, with respect to invasive species, I think it's one of the most challenging thing managing invasive species. We have tried to manage them in protected areas like Bundala, Horton Plains. Even on 22nd May, the National Biological Diversity Day commemoration was carried out at Horton Plains, where they were looking at uh, managing an invasive species called Ulex europaeus. So managing invasive species is a very challenging thing, because these are very hard species to control. So you need long-term engagement at sites to manage them, because the moment you give up, they come back. They're like a cancer. So controlling them requires a great deal of effort, investment, and we have done invasive species management in many places. But again, when you look at those who were involved, they're small scale, mostly done by private sector and NGOs. We have also developed risk assessment criteria to monitor or assess species that are brought into this country to prevent the entry of invasives. Uh, because the best way to control invasive is to prevent them from coming to Sri Lanka. Management comes as a second stage. Once they arrive at Sri Lanka, only we have to manage them. But if you can prevent them through this effective risk assessment, you don't have to even think about managing because you prevent the introduction. But there are a number of issues with implementation of risk assessment. We see even though there are risk assessment criteria, there is a National Invasive Species Specialist Group which oversees it. We still see some species are being brought into the country without paying the due attention. So, and we have also done IES mapping. Once again, it's a little outdated, but we do have the basic ingredients to start working on it, but it requires fair amount of effort to manage them. So IAS management again has to be a planned activity. You can't just go and manage them. You have to have a proper plan when you take up this. And this is something that needs to be done because invasive species are posing a huge threat to our native species and especially endemic species. The last target I'm going to be talking about is sustainably managing agriculture and aquaculture landscapes because we find, as I said earlier, nearly 30% of the land extent is under some form of agriculture. And these agricultural lands are subjected to agrochemicals, pollution, uh, heavy use of fertilizer, which leads to eutrophication of wetlands. So sustainably managing them is very important. Same thing when it comes to aquaculture. We have converted a lot of our mangroves, salt marsh ecosystems, which are very important ecosystems today. They are referred to as blue carbon ecosystems because they can be used to make money. But we have destroyed them to establish aquaculture plants. And now we have to spend a lot of money and effort to restore them back, which is something that is going on in places like Ane Vilundau. But it is sad to see that even as of recent, there has been a gazette notification degazetting part of vegetative nature reserve, which is one of the very rich mangrove salt marsh ecosystems in this country. I'm not saying that aquaculture should not be done, but it has to be done in a planned manner. So here is an area where we will have to influence a lot. We have to rethink, we have to come up with new ways of doing, meeting our agriculture and aquaculture requirements. And finally, all this requires money. We need resources, we need to have uh, press our governments to invest more, but we also have to start looking at new financial tools, such as payment for ecosystem services, biodiversity credits, private sector investment, because national governments alone cannot provide the necessary funding to push uh, the level of investment that is required if we are to change the tide. So this is where I'm going to leave you. It is still not too late. Based on our observations, we still have a lot of biodiversity in this country. And if we act within the next decade or so with a proper planning, we will be able to achieve many of these global targets at a national level and contribute to achieving these global targets, which would make this world a better place, a desirable place to live in. So with that, I would like to stop. Would like to thank IEPSL for giving me this opportunity to come and talk to you. And I would like to thank all of you who have joined today.
Thank you very much, Professor Devaka, for your informative presentation. So now I would like to open this webinar for questions. You can unmute yourself and you can directly ask questions from Professor, and also you can put your questions on the chat box. So Professor Devaka, while others are coming up with their questions, I have small questions for you. So as you mentioned, in your presentations, we are in a very small country, and the land use plan is very, very important. So we have seen in most of the cases, there are some conflict in between agricultural land usage and clearance of natural forests and so on. So what do you think? How can we effectively manage this already existing land for the agriculture and avoid getting new forests for this agriculture activities?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Rishan. It's something that I've also been thinking for a long time, because if you look at our current approach to irrigation development, we borrow large amount of money from foreign banks, like 500 to 600 million dollars, and invest on large reservoirs. If you look at the last couple of decades alone, we've built Yan, Noya, Murugakanda, Kalukanga, like that. The list goes on and on. So much of the money we are investing is on the headworks. We are spending millions of dollars to build huge dams and inundate large areas. And when I have looked at many of these places, I've seen that when you establish a large reservoir, you inundate a lot of agricultural land. You inundate 20, 30 small, medium scale tanks. And you are replacing these people. They have to be translocated. Now, if we can reverse this investment, why can't we invest on the small tanks to enhance them and put the money on technology? Because the technology is available today, like polytunnels, and there are various technologies which helps us to uh, produce more in a more sustainable way. If you take a polytunnel, you don't have to use chemicals. You don't have to use the pesticides the way we are using on a open agricultural land. So what we have to do is maybe think differently. Instead of building large reservoirs, which uh, uh, if you look at many of these large reservoirs have resulted in loss of several thousand hectares. We are losing 7,000 hectares of forest per annum, most of them due to agriculture, irrigation, development. So instead of going down that path, we have these small to medium tanks which have been uh, developed by our ancestors over a period of about 1,500 years. They're beautifully designed ecosystems. Uh, if we try to recreate that, changed our investment plan from putting more money on the headworks and less money on the agriculture versus more money on technology and less money on the headworks, I think we might be able to use our land better and reduce the amount of forest loss we are having today because of the current development paradigm we are chasing. But we need to rethink. It takes a fairly big effort to change, come up with that paradigm shift.
Exactly. Thank you, Professor. I think Yajit, you have your hands up.
Yes, it's a well-compiled presentation. I think we need not speak about it because Professor has so much work in this country. I think the most important thing, as Professor said, our land use plan, we don't have a proper land use plan. And that is something we'll have to concentrate. Other one, I believe, is the awareness. Best places to create awareness is the schools and the universities. Lack of awareness also, Professor, I believe, is one of the reasons for this loss of biodiversity, because our people have taken it as granted. And also another point, this is a bit of a critical thing, what I'm trying to say, don't take me wrong. Some of these so-called people who are doing these biodiversity projects, they do it for marketing strategies. That's also we have seen, because they themselves want to do biodiversity conservation, but they do it for the marketing strategies, but those are business strategies. So my suggestion is how best that we could create awareness among the community about the importance of biodiversity in order to have a sustainable approach to protect we talk about sustainability everywhere, protect this present environment for the future generations?
Yes, I think that's a very important thing. I would go a little further. I think awareness is very critical. Especially, I think we also have to have awareness among the educated. Yeah, I did like, for instance, when you look at a lot of these big projects are done by highly educated people, but they have not been given the proper environmental awareness. When you're building a road, if there's an environment management plan which says you have to wet the road a certain number of times to prevent dust generation, which will result in respiratory diseases in people. And if we fail to do that, that shows lack of awareness even among the educated. So I think this environmental awareness, as you very correctly pointed out, we have to take it to at a very young level, but we also have to provide it for other disciplines which are in, directly involved in massive environmental change to uh, help them to understand that development is requires not just development, it has to be sustainable, and you bring sustainability by being aware of our impact on the environment and taking the necessary measures. So a lot of times we see the environmental management plans are not properly implemented, and that leads to huge environmental issues, once again because people don't believe in it, like the emission certificate. Emission certificate is there for the betterment of everybody, but how many people really believe in taking an emission certificate in that sense? We do it as something that we have to do rather than we should be doing. So how there are things that we have to do, and there are things that we would like to do. And a lot of these things that impact the environment happens because it is not in that we want to do list, saying we have to do list, and therefore we are reluctant to do it. So how do you bring people from have to do to we want to do it? That is coming through awareness, as you rightly pointed out. So we need to do a lot of work uh, to create awareness at all levels, not just children, but even at highly educated people, politicians, because they take decisions that can have significant impact on our environment.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Yajit, for your questions. And also, Professor, this is again linked with the Yajit question. So nowadays we have noticed that most of the organizations, groups, even companies are doing a lot of tree planting programs, restoration programs to celebrate some different days. I know most of them are doing it purely for the purpose of giving a positive impact for the environment, but sometimes just planting trees here and there without a proper plan may harm the existing environment also. So I think it's very important to do a science-based restoration and science-based conservation. So what do you think about that, Professor?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question once again, because I've been involved with a lot of tree plantation programs. One thing I see is sometimes these tree plantation programs do not involve a proper scientists, ecologists who can tell them what type of trees to plant, how to plant, because a forest is not a bunch of trees. A forest has a certain structure, and that is why the forest helps to support such high biodiversity. So when you plant trees, there are the first advantage you get is the carbon benefit. So a lot of people only think about carbon sequestration, but what we would like to point out is if you plan it properly, you can get carbon benefits, and on top of that, you can get biodiversity benefits. And I think the private sector also has to be thinking about it, because all these years we have been trying to be carbon neutral. But in a post-2020 milieu, we are not only talking about carbon neutrality, we are talking about biodiversity friendly or supporting biodiversity. Things like biodiversity credits are going to come in a big way in the future, not just carbon credits. So when people are investing in tree plantation, they have to properly consult people who can help them to identify which trees to plant and which way to plant it and how can you get maximum benefit out of it. And also the other thing I think, when you engage in a tree planting exercise, one has to understand that it's a long-term thing. It's not just going and planting few trees on the ground and come back, because wherever that has been done, we see within few months those trees die and we are back to square one after spending a lot of money. So there has to be a maintenance plan, uh, so that you stay with the site uh, until those trees can fend for themselves. So tree planting requires planning, it requires technical know-how. Otherwise, most of these tree plantation programs either fail or they fail to achieve the maximum benefits that can be accrued through the investment they are making. So I think that is the message I would like to give. It's a very good thing to do, but it can be, if you don't do it properly, you cannot get the desired results.
Right. Thank you, Professor. So it's 10 minutes past 8. So if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up this webinar today. I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Devaka Veerakon. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, Professor, and also spending your valuable time with us. Then I would like to thank President and Council member of the IEPSL, especially the academic and examination committee of the IEPSL, especially Dr. Pradeep Gachanayaka. Thank you very much for your effort in arranging this webinar. Finally, thank you all our participants who joined through the Zoom platform, as well as our YouTube and Facebook live stream. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.